Welcome to the Farms in BC podcast. I'm your host, Jay Cack, and today is officially our 10th episode, so we picked a special topic for you guys. Nav, Sikon, and I will be sitting down to discuss the world of cannabis. Stay tuned. All right, Nav, so now, 10th episode.
Yeah.
To celebrate the occasion, we got a fun one. We got cannabis, and the cannabis industry is taking BC by storm.
Yeah, it did.
It is one of the newer industries in the playing field, right? But maybe tell us about your experience with it.
The cannabis industry has been quite a roller coaster, I would say. It first came to my attention in about 2010. So what happened was, out of nowhere, I would get random calls from people saying, "Hey, do you sell farmland? Do you know of any barns for rent?" And I was like, "For what?" And it started happening like on a month-to-month basis, and it just started accelerating from 2010. And I'm like, "Well, what are you going to use it for?" And the first 5-6 times they're like cannabis, right? And I'm like, "No," I don't want to it's not my thing, right? And then over time, like a couple months later, I forgot who told me, someone said it to me. They said it's for cannabis. And I'm like, "Hey man," I don't want to waste my time. I don't want to waste your time. I'm not going to deal with stuff like this, right? Mm-hmm. And then he said, "No, it's legal." And when he said the word "it's legal," I said, "Well, what do you mean it's legal?" No, it's not. It's illegal. Mm-hmm. And he's like, "No, I have a license." And then I said, "Well, who do you have your license from?" And he was like, "Oh, I've got a license from Health Canada." Mm-hmm. I go, "Canada gave you a license to grow marijuana so you can use it for yourself?" He said, "Yes." And I was like, "Okay." So then, a few days went by and I called a few of my lawyer friends. I said, "Hey, I'm getting these calls for people that want to rent barns to grow their own cannabis. And is this legal?" Some lawyers didn't even know about it. And a few said, "Yeah." He's like, "I've been a few of my clients are dealing with this situation." And so he explained the whole situation to me. So 2010 was kind of the first little wind that I had about the cannabis industry.
Yeah, wow. And that's early on too, right?
It was early on. And at that time, I don't think there was only a few people that were even talking about legalization.
Yeah.
I guess there was a small group that already knew it was coming. And I finally got introduced to that type of group. But the mass public, the general public, they had no clue. That's right. Right? It was always, it's that thing.
Legalization was like actually way later.
It was much later, yeah. But back then it was a stigma of like, oh, it's negative, it's bad, it's a drug. Mm-hmm. Well, still it is a drug today. It's just that it was looked at differently than it is today, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I guess what was the factors that contributed to that growth? Like it went up on a huge trajectory, right? So
yeah. Well, I think the amount of patient licenses that they started, I'm assuming that the amount of patient licenses that were applied for with Health Canada, more and more people started applying. Legalization has been, I believe it was from like the mid 90s or even early 90s, they were trying to push legalization of marijuana. Again, a very small crowd going up against lobbying the government. And I guess once the corporations got involved in like early 2010 or even probably early 2000s behind closed doors, is that you can probably see where the lobbying started, and it took maybe 10 to 20 years before it got legalized.
And I mean, legalization officially, is it Canada-wide or BC-wide?
It's Canada-wide.
Canada-wide, right? That was actually 2018.
2018, yeah.
That's when everything kind of changed. That's when it became public knowledge, and everything kind of, I guess it was the production that became commercial at that point.
Well, yeah, what happened was they've set forth certain licenses for mass production, marketing, retailing. There's just that whole chain, like pretty much liquor stores. Like you got a distillery, you got a product, and then you sell it to Health Canada, and then Health Canada would go and distribute it to the liquor stores, right?
Now, how did this impact the agricultural, like farm market, the real estate market?
So back from like 2010 to about 2013, 14, I would get those calls for, renting barns and things like that. So we saw a big fluctuation of existing farmers renting out their barns for cannabis because it was legal. It helped them to achieve extra cash flow for their farm. They've got their crops. They might have had a small 1,000 square foot barn to 10,000 square foot barn. And they said, hey, it's legal. We're allowed to do this. It's some good cash flow. They went ahead and started renting out their buildings. So that was probably till like 2013. And then after that, what we saw was we saw people started buying from 2015 and about 2018, I think before it went legal, we saw a big group of corporations starting to call us and saying, hey, we want to buy farms. Mm-hmm. It wasn't renting anymore. It was, hey, we want to buy. We want to, and it was anywhere from 5 acres from the small guy that had a patient license up to a big public traded companies that wanted to buy massive greenhouse operations to do conversions. And it just started, it really ramped up the pricing of agricultural land at that time. Especially if it had a building or a greenhouse, I remember at that time, it was like a full year. I think our back end staff, all we worked on was finding greenhouses for a full year.
Wow. What year was that?
I believe that was, I'm going to say that was between late 2017 to probably end of 2019. It started trickling 2017, and you didn't see a lot of these execution of sales from like beginning of 2018 before they announced legalization, and probably a year after legalization was set forth, yeah.
Now, I guess we should get into a little bit more of the types of cannabis licenses and kind of the different things that they require in terms of facilities and land and everything else. So what are the different types of licenses?
So the ones that I know there's a lot of smaller licenses. I'm just going to talk about the licenses I'm familiar with. Mm-hmm. So there's the one that everybody has heard of is the LP license, the licensed producer. Though that category is pretty much, there's a set amount of licenses in Canada, and only a few companies have those. So like your big canopy, like the ones that everyone's have heard, the bigger corporations have those licenses. So that's the LP license, licensed producer, where they are allowed to grow in mass, and they're allowed to wholesale directly to retail stores. So that's that type of license. Then there's a micro license. Well, then after that was the patient license. So an individual can say, hey, I've got this problem, might be injury, might be skin care, might be mental illness. They would apply, a doctor would have to subscribe it to them. They would go and apply, and they would get a certain amount of dosage that they can grow for themselves. That's a patient license. Then there was micro licenses. That just came out about a couple years ago, 2 years ago, I believe. And the way the micro licenses work is the maximum growing area you can grow in is in about 2,500 square feet. And you have to sell that product to an LP license, who then sells it to the retails, right? So the micro, from my understanding, because I know a few people that own some of these retail stores, the micro cannabis that is grown is supposed to be much potent, more better, more desirable from the public that are smoking more of the flower versus using it for creams and creating products. So they create like almost like it's like a craft quality, high quality product. And then they would sell that to an LP. An LP they wouldn't really focus in on high quality product. They would be, hey, how do we grow mass? Growing it in mass, right? So it'd be lower quality. And then there's the retail licenses themselves to actually get a license from the city, from Health Canada, to actually create a retail store brand and open that up. Gotcha. And then there's the hemp licenses, where they would get hemp license to grow on a farm. You can grow hemp on your 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 acre farm.
That's just like a base product for other stuff, right? So the micro is really interesting because that's the one I'm most familiar with. That's the clients that we see typically, like on a farm and whatnot. Yeah. And the closest analogy to that is that I can think of is a micro brewery, for example, like something like that, a craft brewery, right?
It's the same thing. So if you look at consider your LP licenses, something like your big Budweisers, your Bacardis, your Crown Royals, like those are the big players. Then you've got these craft breweries. Consider those as your micro licenses, similar. Then you've got your retail stores as for your liquor stores. So when they legalized it, they built this chain mimic to liquor stores.
So I guess what is the process now to get these licenses, and how does that work?
So you would have to apply to Health Canada. And then each license has a separate criteria. Licensed producer licenses were very hard to get. I don't know of anyone that really has applied now just because of how bad the industry is doing. But they were the hardest to get. Micro licenses were the second hardest to get. Well, actually, no, I'm going to say the retail licenses were second hardest to get. I think that was probably the downfall of the cannabis industry, is that even though that the federal government approved this on the BC level and the municipal level, they never allowed them to open up enough stores fast enough.
Right.
So they had all this product, but they weren't be able to sell it because I think Surrey still doesn't have a cannabis store, from my understanding. It's just the municipalities were just throwing these roadblocks that we don't want it here. It still had that stigma that you and I were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah, no, it was definitely in the news. I remember this talk happening that there just wasn't enough to.
There's no retailers, right?
There's no retail. And
then there was the hemp license, very easy to get. Pretty much any farm can go ahead and get that license. And then the micro licenses, again, it's difficult to get because you still need municipal approval. And the way what the municipalities did is, again, they don't want it either. So they made it very hard they never said no because it's a federal license, but they just made the parameters so hard that it's hard to find that specific type of property that can fit that type of license.
And that was for which one? That was micro. Gotcha.
Well, that's if you do it on a farm.
Right.
But you can actually do a micro in a warehouse.
Okay.
You don't have to do it on a farm. You can go buy a 3,000 square foot industrial unit, grow in 2,500 square feet of it, make 1,000 square feet of it as your office packing area. You can do it there. You don't have to do it on a farm.
And I mean, there's the trajectory, and we know it was ramping up to a certain point. I don't know what year that was, where it kind of leveled off, and now it's kind of down.
It took a big fall. It's not a small fall. I think that hype in 2017, 18, 19. The way I saw it grow, and I knew, I didn't invest in any of the cannabis stocks. I never believed in the industry. There was just too much. When there's too much hype, and your average Joe is talking about, the cannabis industry, and I put this much money in, and I'm like, okay, you have no clue about this industry. We're seeing it on the back end with these guys. They say they're growing a certain amount of product, which their greenhouses are empty, because we would sell the greenhouses, right? Yeah. But so it was more of I'm not gonna it was a situation where you saw the public traded companies setting up projections that could have been true because they own the real estate and they can prove it by the infrastructure. The one factor that a lot of the investors didn't know was, how successful will they be with cannabis in greenhouses? And the other factor was, they didn't know that the lower end municipalities, provincial governments would have put these many roadblocks. So those were the two downfalls that I saw. It was the inexperience in growing in big spaces, and there was the roadblocks from the municipalities to not allow them to go ahead and open up retail stores, allowing micros, just letting it out there, right? Yeah, they're still capping it. It's still pretty capped. It's still hard to get some of these retail licenses.
Yeah, and this was a fledgling industry. So you made a good point that they didn't have the experience to grow in the greenhouses, the big spaces, and all that.
And everybody went in head first. A lot of companies went in head first. Yeah.
And we still hear about it, where these folks are still trying to get out now, or if they haven't already, they're still.
We've sold 2 greenhouses that were slated for cannabis from cannabis LP companies in the last 2 years because it just never succeeded. We do get the random call now here and there. I think you visited a few now as well, yeah. It's one of those things that the hype is over, and I think what's going to happen, it's going to flush all of the inexperienced individuals. And it's also going to flush out these bigger companies that didn't actually have a good backing, good product, good projections. it was more of a pump and dump versus, hey, this is a business, I believe in it. I don't care what the market does, we're going to thrive. And there are a lot of companies that did succeed still and are still succeeding.
Yeah, and those are the ones that everybody's trying to be like. However, they just don't understand the commitment that it takes to get to that level, right?
Yeah.
You got to put all your weight behind it, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of folks that started it, but they didn't put that weight behind it, right?
Yeah.
So I guess what kind of properties appeal to each of these licenses? You mentioned greenhouses. I imagine that's towards like the bigger licenses.
Greenhouses appealed more to the LP licenses. Micro licenses appealed more to, they made this ridiculous setback. Like you had to, I forget what it was. I think it was 100 feet. Okay. 100 feet or 150, no, was it 100 meters? They made this ridiculous setback. I just forgot now what it was. But they made this ridiculous setback that you had to have been from certain points from the neighboring property and to make the building. So you have to make the building in the middle of the property. And I believe the last time I researched it for one of my clients, you had to have been about like a 20-acre parcel or a 10-acre that's square, which is hard to find, as you know, right?
That's right. That's right.
So those got affected. 5 acres only got affected with the patient license guys. Because patient licenses, what we did see is you're legal, with patient licenses, you're allowed to have 4 licenses per one farm. And you can hire a designated grower. So what we did see is the 5 acres got affected by the grower who was growing for the 4 patients. So anything with the barn building, again, that we were selling so many 5, 10, 15 acres in from 2017 to 2016 to about 2019. Just if it had a building on it, chances are a cannabis guy was calling.
And what's interesting is those guys that got in early 2015, 16, 17, before the legalization.
That wasn't early. Actually, they were.
Actually, that's right.
They were late. They thought they were early.
Yeah.
The guys that got in around 2007, because I found out in 2010, and I've heard that people were doing it 5 years prior to that. So maybe even 2005 to 2010, whoever got in, they were pretty much the root growers. Then they got into all these other avenues well before, like 2015, you were late to the game.
Yeah, they had the time to experiment and really refine their techniques and grow, right? So when that became legal, they could really expand.
That's right.
They had already done the work behind the smaller. Now, I guess let's discuss a little bit more on the future projections of the industry. In your opinion, what do you think the cannabis industry is going to be like in the future? I
think it's going to be fine. Like any other industry, when there's so much hype, the cream rises to the top.
Right.
Everybody else is going to disappear, and the guys that are going to survive it, that are doing decent now, their profit margins are not the greatest, but they're surviving. Their margins are decent, but they have enough money to keep continuing to grow. They're going to do fine and they're going to thrive because this is a new industry. 2018 is not too long ago. We're talking 20 years from now, they're going to be mammoths of companies. They're going to have they might create more products. Because if you actually go, have you been to a cannabis retail store?
Not much.
I've been in 2 of them, just because of curiosity. And like, you're starting to see cannabis drinks. You're starting to see different, like completely different cannabis products. What are those? Like gummies, candies.
CBD oils and stuff like that.
CBD is a big market. So like, this is just starting. Yeah. And I think over time, I think it's going to be fine. It's just the riffraff is all gone. These are serious companies that have weathered the storm, like any other business, any other industry. You weather the storm, you're gonna come out an animal. And I think that's what's going to happen now.
What do you think the impact's going to be on agricultural real estate?
I don't think it's going to make any of an impact. Like, it's not going to make much of an impact. I think the impact that was supposed to happen happened. The people that have bought some of these farm properties for cannabis, they'll exit here in the next 5 years, and traditional farming will continue. It's not going to impact agricultural properties moving forward. I don't think it will.
Yeah, and then that naturally leads into the buying and selling of properties that used to be cannabis facilities. And what are some considerations in that?
Well, that's the challenge we're seeing is tens of millions of dollars were spent to convert these bigger facilities into cannabis. They don't really to convert them back, it's really pricey. So a lot of these greenhouses that are selling, they're selling almost at like 40 to 50 cents on the dollar, because the amount of cost that it's going to take to reconvert it is quite high back into a vegetable farm.
Yeah, and I mean, there's some that have the foresight to plan accordingly. And we had a client that basically built a massive barn, but within it built a wooden structure so that it was like completely contained within there. Super smart. And so after they were done with that, they just kind of took out that facility inside within the building.
And now they've got a barn.
And they got a nice, beautiful barn that's untouched.
And he got top dollar for his property.
Just that a little bit of foresight goes a long way, right?
Yeah.
So if you are planning to buy one, get into the market, and then of course exit at some point, just plan ahead, right?
Yeah.
And I noticed one more point where the stigma kind of comes in, and we're seeing it on the real estate side. Within the property disclosure statements, you find these little statements about disclosure of marijuana creation in the buildings. Usually it's related to the homes, but I assume there's
even buildings. I think some sellers are afraid to disclose that they used to have one in a barn. Disclose it.
Just disclose it, yeah.
Like, you'd be surprised, most buyers don't care if it was in a barn. No banks really care if it was on a barn. People really care if it was in a house. Banks care if it was in a house. Disclose. There's no point of having a problem in the future over a minor disclosure.
I feel like
and even now, like, we've sold properties where there was cannabis growing in the barn while we had it for sale. The banks and the institutions are okay to lend on them as long as they clean it out before completion.
Okay.
And the bankers will come and do a final inspection to make sure that they're completely out. Okay. And the new buyer will not be allowed to grow. Banks still don't lend to properties that have cannabis growing on it, even though it's in a barn, even though it's legal.
I feel like it's more of an issue on the house side of things, but when it's in the building side of things, it's a little bit more relaxed. It's a little bit more.
It's forgiven because it's not a living. It's no one's living in there.
Right.
But still disclose.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to be continuing in these documentations?
Yeah,
it'll
sure.
probably be
for sure
long term.
Yeah, that will be long term, because I think the way they've worded it now in the property disclosure, it's not just marijuana or cannabis. It's like anything illegal.
Right. Oh, gotcha.
Right? It's not, so they've kind of changed the wording, and I don't know, maybe we do a podcast on mushrooms one day, because that was a big industry that kind of swooped in right after cannabis did, because while it's still in talks, the mushroom industry might, the psychedelic mushrooms might be the next big boom, right?
Yeah. No, for sure. And I think that's another agricultural product that does have huge potential, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting because these new industries come out of nowhere, but at the same time, they're massive industries, or they were underground, but in reality, there was huge potential there, right?
Yeah.
So they're naturally just kind of coming up.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
No, just, when you're buying a farm that has cannabis currently growing on it, make sure you got your full disclosures in place, that the seller has disclosed, plus that you do get it cleaned out before your subject removal or closing. If you're a seller thinking about selling a property that has cannabis growing on it now, it's better to list it after it's cleaned.
Right.
But still disclose.
Right.
It is a tougher sell while they are growing in there.
Any advice for somebody that has a micro or something going on and they still want to sell it, but maybe they want to sell it with that included or keeping it in?
You are going to sell a business, because a patient license is not a business, that's for personal use.
Right.
This is a business that you're selling, but the challenge they're going to have is still getting financing. Well, we would have to see if there's any institutions that would fund a purchaser that would buy a micro business. The alternative is you go private lending. You get your money from a MIC, but you're going to have to put down like 50% down.
I mean, that definitely answers that, but I mean, it makes it a much more niche buyer pool that you're going to be working with.
Very, like on the micro side, there's not many buyers that are calling saying, hey, I want to buy a micro license business.
Would it not skip a lot of steps if they already had the micro license and if they really wanted to get into something like this, right?
Yeah. I'm just saying there's a small buyer pool.
It is.
Yeah.
That's right. You're narrowing it down.
You're
of course.
very,
No, that's an exact question I had from a client. So
Okay.
it's good to kind of get these straight from you, right?
Yeah.
So awesome, man. I appreciate the episode. Let's go.